Welcome and thanks for joining us today for Migrating to Magento 2 Procedures, Practices, and Pitfalls. We will be having a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation, so please submit your questions at any time on the questions pane on the right side of your screen. You can also follow us on Twitter at InteractOne, and you can tweet with us today using hashtag Magento2Migration. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce InteractOne's CEO and President, Brian Dwyer.
Thanks, Amanda. And thanks all to you for tuning in with us today. We've, I think, all been victims of the hype over the last couple of years about Magento 2. And that's part of the reason we're really excited to share with you to be among the first to explain why it's been worth the wait. So first on our agenda is to partially answer why the upgrade. Beyond the fact it's shiny and new, we'll walk you through the business justification. Then you'll witness a live data migration from start to finish led by our Magento aficionado, Ryan Street. And Ryan will then share with you some of the gotchas you need to be aware of in that migration process. And then we'll try to answer some of your Qs with As. We've tried to ensure that today's content is of interest to all our audience, both programmers and non-programmers alike. So I'm sure some of you are asking, who is InteractOne and what do they know about Magento 2? Well, this is our 17th year in business. We started back in 1998, so you can put that in perspective. Apple introduced the iMac that year. Microsoft launched Windows 98. The FDA approved the little blue pill. And Google was a startup. Now, we've been here almost since the birth of e-commerce. Our first platform was Miva. That was almost 15 years ago, and that was followed by OS Commerce, then finally to Magento in 2008. As a matter of fact, we were with Magento before they were renamed to Magento. We've been working on this code since beta version 0.6. We were actually one of their first partners. We were the first partner to develop formalized customer training, and we were among the pioneers to build an enterprise site for a Fortune 100 account. We're based in Cincinnati with all our developers here in the United States. Living at the epicenter of e-commerce for the last 17 years, we've learned to continually reinvent ourselves. We've adapted to the continual disruptive model that really drives technology. The tech graveyard is littered with companies that were once market leaders, but were subsequently overrun by competitors who push forward with innovation, both marketing and technology. They are the disruptors. Magento is now at the precipice. The e-commerce platform segment has gone through tremendous redefinition since Magento was the primary disruptor. Today's marketplace demands improved performance and scalability. It must address the onslaught of mobile. It must provide a total flexible architecture. It is these and other issues that Magento 1 cannot satisfy, but through Magento 2 will again redefine the market. It will do so through database improvements. With Magento, its single point of failure has always been the database. You can scale out front-end web servers, you can deliver all your content through a CDN, and you can use load balancing and failover to handle it all. But at the end of the day, Magento's Achilles heel has always been its MySQL database, but really no more. With Magento 2, you can have standalone databases for order management, for the catalog and customer databases, and for checkout. Total independence. And you're no longer trapped with MySQL. Magento 2 also works with Oracle, SQL, and MySQL. So this gives you really total freedom to handle tons of traffic and controlled traffic. Too much front-end traffic slowing down those in the checkout? It's not an issue because now you have a dedicated database making it faster and easier for people to check out. And because of the database improvements, you can have over 25 concurrent admins updating the catalog while you have another 50 users in the admin back-end processing orders. Power and flexibility. So let's talk about speed and scalability improvements. Magento 2 is 25% faster for end users browsing in the site, and it's 52% faster adding products to the cart. And that's using the standard out-of-the-box configurations. We think that with this version, you can easily support 10 million page views per hour. Now, you can compare that to the current 500,000 on Magento 1.9 or 1.14. And then there's the improved checkout, which will increase conversion. Now, there have been many one-page simplified checkout extensions over the years, and many of them have actually made the checkout process worse. Many of us have been victims of the errors that they throw, including shipping or payment processing portions. So instead, Magento 2 reimagines the checkout process, making it user-friendly and efficient. Look at Magento 1 is hamstrung. It's being dependent upon its Zen framework. Magento 2 uses multiple frameworks, and it's all best of breed. There are no longer any scalability limits, no speed issues. So that makes it less prone to hacking because it's state-of-the-art code. M2 makes existing software obsolete. And let me be clear about this. At the end of the day, staying with Magento, you will eventually need to and will want to, I think, upgrade to M2. It's inevitable, as is with every software. We all realize every software has a shelf life. Pick a number, 1, 2, 3 years. But eventually hackers will find vulnerabilities, or because of improvements in the server's OS or hardware, it's going to be some outside force will necessitate a change. And quite frankly, if you're an astute merchant, you really won't want to wait until you're forced to change. Let me put it this way. The iPod was great, but then came the iPhone. Migrating to M2 is a 3-step process. First you migrate the data. You're going to physically take the existing Magento data and make it compatible with M2. It's a relatively easy process, which is what we're going to be discussing today. And then you'll need to migrate the extensions. And remember, there's 2 kinds of extensions, one for functionality and the other for integrations. And it's all new. You cannot carry the existing extensions forward. And finally, you'll need to migrate the front end and all those cute customizations you've made. Now, Magento guru Ryan Street is here with me. Well, Ryan, please take a second and why don't you tell the audience about yourself?
Thank you, Brian. My name is Ryan Street. I am one of the Magento U trainers. I've been working with Magento for going on 5 years now, full-time, working with Enterprise and Community Edition, and I've been working with M2 and the migration tool as much as I can to get up to speed for the new M2 launch.
Thank you. So, Ryan, as a non-programmer, I've seen you do this. The first hurdle is really migrating the data. It looks relatively easy. So let me ask, really, what's it take in skill set for a programmer to do this? On a scale of 1 to 10, what kind of skill set will it take to migrate the data?
I would say that if you're a Magento programmer and you've been doing it for a while, I would say this is anywhere between a 4 and a 5. It's new code, it's a new platform, but at the same time, a lot of things are going to look familiar, so you're going to get up to speed to it.
So that sounds bearable for most programmers. And what about the skill set for the extensions?
I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, if that's what we're using again, the one for the extensions is going to be a fair bit steeper, especially in the beginning. We're talking about maybe even 8 or a 9, because you're talking about a new platform. And the good news is that the more you do it, it's like flexing, it's like working a muscle. It gets easier, but you'll see that a lot of things will look familiar once you get over the hurdles of the platform differences. Since we're using modern tech stacks and we're using modern PHP programming practices against the latest version. So those types of things you'll have to get used to, but after that it gets a little easier. But if I had to reiterate, probably about an 8 or a 9.
So will somebody have to completely rewrite the extensions?
That's Good news and a bad news. For one thing, it is a new platform. So this isn't just a new numbered version like going from 113 to 114. This is a new platform. It is called Magento 2, but you will have to rewrite all of the extensions. The good news is that a lot of the algorithms and a lot of the functionality that they took for Magento 1, they did port over for Magento 2. They used the modern tech stack, they used the modern platform that they've built, and the architecture that they've used, but you'll start to see a lot of familiar things once you get over that initial hurdle of figuring out exactly how Magento works on an architectural level.
So as a non-programmer, that sounded to me like blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So translating that, would it be safe to say the extension element is not for the rookie or the relative newcomer of Magento?
I would say that, yes. It would not be for the person who's brand new to programming or brand new to PHP. There's a lot of really strong patterns that are used to build in flexibility to Magento's 2 platform. So I would say definitely yes, it's not for the rookie or the newcomer.
And then for the third phase, the theme and the front end, somebody just upgraded to responsive, what effect is the M2 on the new design style?
Well, for the new design style, they've taken a different approach for Magento 2, meaning that while a lot of the concepts are the same, the approach is going to be different. So that's going to be an initial hurdle to tackle as well for all the front-end theme designers. So that will be a little bit of a hurdle as well. But once again, once you get past that with the platform and architectural differences, it'll all start to look very familiar again. Layouts, blocks, template files, all that kind of stuff.
So collectively, if you'd agree with this, it sounds like this is really a big deal. It's after all migrating to an entirely new platform, right?
Essentially, yes.
And so with that said, would you walk us through the easiest part, the data migration?
Sure thing. All right, thank you. All right, so when we're talking about the data migration, this is the first step in kind of the 3-step process of migrating Magento 1 to Magento 2. And the good news is that the Magento 2 team has given us a tool to migrate the data portion of our M1 site. And the data migration tool allows users to incrementally migrate their key data from Magento 1 to Magento 2. It allows them to migrate their data over, and it's all of their key merchant data. This would be your website and your store information. This would be your products, your customers, your orders, and all that other tertiary data. The good news about this is because they developed this gives the merchants more time and resources to focus on the steps 2 and the steps 3 that we just talked about. It gives them more time to focus on the theme and the extension porting over to Magento 2. But at its core, Magento's data migration tool is a command line tool for Magento 2. It connects to a database that you configure holding Magento 1 data and performs what's called an ETL, or an extract, transform, and load process over to Magento 2. It performs 3 main functions. It does a settings migration, which is exactly what it sounds like. It migrates all of your settings that were normally located in your system configuration in M1. It takes all those and migrates those all over to Magento 2. The second thing it does is the big part, the big heavy lifting part, and that's the data migration. The data migration is all of the data that you need, your products, your customers, your orders, all that information gets migrated. And one of the best features about this migration tool is the third function, and that is what's called a delta migration. So once you have performed your initial data migration, you don't want to necessarily have to wait for all that data to come over while being offline. The good news is that the migration tool performs what's called a delta migration. And that delta migration is essentially, it will bridge the gap between its last data import and any new information that has come across. This allows you to make sure that all of the information is over there and everything has been reconciled before you cut over to Magento 2. The good news is that you don't have to take your Magento 1 store offline when you're doing this data migration. You can take a M1 version of your database, a snapshot of it, a backup of it, and then perform this initial data migration ahead of time. And that's what's truly beneficial about it. And then as you're about to perform the cutover of your data migration, migration from M1 to M2, what you can do is you can perform that delta migration. And essentially it will take its last migration standing and it will take any new orders or customers or products or product updates that you have made since the tool was last run. So that will minimize the amount of downtime that you'll have when you're cutting over to M2. So you don't have to spend hours and hours and hours offline. You can just go offline for the last Delta portion and then cut over to M2, and you'll know all of the data has been there. So you're not going to have any worries about lost customers, unupdated products or non-activated products. Any new customers will still be there that have been added since the last time you did this migration. Okay, so as far as the versions of the migration tool available, the version supported for Magento 1 is 1.6 through 1.9 for community, and Enterprise Edition 1.11 through 1.14. It does not go earlier than that. So if you do have an earlier version of that, let's say Enterprise Edition 1.10, you will have to upgrade to at least one of these versions to utilize this data migration tool. So the good news is that the guys over here can help you with that at InteractOne. So what do we do to kind of get this tool up and running? Well, there's a couple of different things that we need to do to get our installation and setup going for us. First of all, we need an instance of your Magento 1 database. The good news is that you don't have to have an up and running code base in order for this to work. You just need to have the data or the database itself. That can be placed on the current server with M2 or maybe even on a separate one if you need more hardware. Then, of course, you need a working copy and an active copy of the Magento 2 code base and, of course, the database where you want your M1 data to be migrated over to. And then you need a tool called Composer. We're not going to get into all the details about what Composer is, but essentially what it is the package manager for PHP. If you've worked with Magento 2, you know you've worked with Composer. If you can successfully install Magento 2, you can install this data migration tool. So as far as installation goes, basically what you want to do is you'll want to use Composer to install Magento 2. And then you'll want to also use the Composer to install the migration tool itself. And it's a very easy process, just a couple of commands and everything's been installed for you. After that, you'll want to import your clean copy of the database from Magento 1 over to wherever you need to have it be placed. And that would be either, once again, either in your local or maybe on a separate server that has a little bit more hardware behind it. And then if you have it on a separate server, you need to make sure you're configuring your MySQL settings appropriately. Usually this would be an instance where you need to have them talk to one another if they're on separate servers. But for the most part, that configuration is pretty minimal. So after you've gotten everything installed and set up, what you want to do is you want to kind of go through the configuration portion or kind of running through it to get all the bugs worked out. And by bugs, I mean all the data that needs to be copied over. So the first thing you're going to do is you want to start with a clean copy and you want to perform a test run. And you want to see exactly what happens and what goes wrong. A lot of times the the data migration tool for Magento 2 will have what's called an integrity check. And the integrity check allows you to see what data might be missing or might be mismatched from your Magento 1 instance over to your Magento 2 instance. The good news is it'll tell you exactly what it is and where it originates. Is it in the source or the destination? What fields are missing? What fields are mismatched? What do you want to do with those? And it'll throw those errors for you. So after you check for all those failures, you need to see what needs to be mapped over. So a couple of columns might not have been mapped. A couple of columns might be missing. What do you want to do with those columns? Do you want to bring them over? Are they no longer needed because of its remnants from maybe an old extension? What do you want to do with these particular fields and this data that you want to maybe possibly put into my Magento 2 or maybe even just leave out? So after that, you want to map the failures to the new database through its appropriate mapping files, which we'll see here in our demo in just a second. And basically, we're going to rinse and repeat this. We're going to run it again. We're going to check for failures. And then you're going to make those changes and then run it again, check for failures. And once you get to a good point, that's when you know that you can run your data migration tool with everything necessary. So that's pretty much enough talking about it. Let's go ahead and see it in action. So what I have here is just a plain Magento 2 instance without any data inside of it. Catalog and customers, and there's other data as well, but these are the two ones that I have. This is pretty much just a clean installation. So what I want to do is I want to run the data migration tool. Now the data migration tool is a command line tool like we said earlier. So if I run that from the command line, it'll give us a couple of options of what we have. So basically our usage is we call the migrate function, we specify the mode, which we talked about earlier, your settings, your data, and your delta, and then the configuration file that you want to use, which we'll see here in just a second. There's a couple other available options as well in case you want to do any extra debugging. If you want to reset it, if you want to increase the verbosity, so on and so forth. All right. Now let's take a look at some of those mapping files and those files that you need to set up in order to run your migration tool. So pulling up our files, we have two main ones that we'll be working with the most whenever you're running the migration tool is a configuration or a config XML, and you have a map XML. The configuration XML has a number of different things that allow you to run the different steps necessary, and a lot of this has been pre-configured for you. You're not building this configuration XML file from scratch. It's already been built. You might just need to perform a couple of alterations. The one thing you usually will do, though, is you will need to configure your source and your destination database. Your source stands for your M1 instance of your database, and your destination is your M2 instance of the database. The ones we have here are fine. And like I said, if you need to configure extra parameters, let's say if you need it on another server, you can do that here. And you can also do things like specify passwords and whatnot. So, password. But that's all at a minimum that you need to configure is the source information, or basically your connection information for your database. The other one that you'll be working with the most is what's called a map.xml file. And your map.xml file allows you to configure the different errors and other things that are necessary to map your information over from Magento 1 to Magento 2. So first of all, you have what's called a source, and these are the ones that are in your Magento 1 instance. Okay? These are the mappings that are necessary. This is your table information, this is your column or field information, all this information's inside of here. You also have what's called destination mappings, and that's the exact same thing over in the Magento 2 instance. You have what are called document rules. Document rules are for your database tables. So for example, you can specify that you want to ignore a database table. So you're basically telling the data migration tool that you just want to ignore everything that's coming over. I don't want to have this table come over at all. I just want to ignore it entirely. Okay? Another thing you can do is you can specify a rename. And a rename does exactly that. You can say this table that's currently here, I want that to be renamed to another table for the migration purposes, or I want it to be mapped to a different table. Okay? Then you have what are called field rules. Now field rules go a little bit more granular. What they do is these are the individual columns for your database tables. They are inside of your database tables. So inside of here, you have a move node that's available to you, which is essentially allows you to rename columns from M1 to M2. It's named this in M1. I want this data to be over here in this other column in M2. It also has an ignore. This allows you to ignore certain columns in the table. So let's say you have an IP address or a remote IP or something like that that just isn't needed for your M2 instance. You can just go ahead and ignore that, and the migration tool won't transfer it over. And then the last one, which is a little bit more complex but very, very useful, is called transform. Transform allows you to transform how the data is between the source and the destination, or from the M1 instance to the M2 instance. So let's say that originally when you created a column, it was maybe in a text, or it was maybe in a varchar, or maybe it was something like that, and you want that transformed into something else. Or maybe you have comma-separated values or serialized data that you want to have transformed into another type of data when it gets over to the destination. It's very, very powerful to have this because you can then specify exactly how it gets transformed. There are the out-of-the-box versions, out-of-the-box classes more specifically, and you can also specify your own as well. So there's also a number of other files that are available here, things like class mapping and customer attribute groups and other things like that, and you can get an idea of exactly what it takes to maybe bring over some extra custom entities or custom tables inside of these extra files, and they're all very similar in their form to your map and your config XML. So moving back to the command line tool, we see that we have our migrate mode. And we have our config path, and then we have any options that we want to set. So need to correct that or else we would have had an error. So what we want to do maybe first is call a migration of the settings, PHP. So PHP bin migrate settings is the mode that we specify, and we also need to specify the configuration file that we're going to be using for this mapping. So it'll be under etc CE to CE 1910, and it will be config. So when I specify this, it will then migrate over our settings. First thing that it does when it migrates is it runs what's called the integrity check, and that's just to make sure that all of the data is in good form to be migrated over to Magento 2. Okay? And so that's already finished. We're already done with that. The next thing we want to do is perform an actual data migration. So using the same command, php and migrate, we want to do data this time, and a lot of the same configuration. Let's see, CE to CE, 19 config, and then it will perform the migration for us. And if you'll notice, it's performing a set of integrity checks to make sure all of our data is intact. We actually have a mismatch of a data type on one of our destination documents, and it's going to go ahead and it's going to perform this data migration. Now this is going to take a second, and we don't want to just have you guys wait the entire time. So I'm actually going to move it back over to Brian. He's going to talk a little bit more about some of the business stuff.
Well, that was exciting. Not. And for the non-programmers out there, 3, you're feeling more awake. 2, you're aware of your surroundings. And 1, you're fully awake and aware. So let's chat for a minute about InteractOne's process of how we migrate a site. There are 3 phases: discovery, planning, and execution. With discovery, we have a 5-step process. We first look at the extension for features and functionality. Now remember, Magento 1 extensions cannot be migrated to Magento 2, so we've got to determine what's available in Magento Connect and fix and/or rewrite. Then step 2, we check for upgraded integration Magento 2 extensions, and again, fix or rewrite. Then step 3, we evaluate the order fulfillment process and the requirements to ensure it will be compatible with Magento 2. And then step 4, does the Magento migration tool cover all the data migration needs? And then step 5, we evaluate the UX and the UI and branding needs. And then we go into phase 2, which is planning. So we look at all the discovery steps, we identify the trouble spots and the bottlenecks, and we try to determine a timetable. Now the second part of planning is to determine the go live strategy. Now you know that you don't have to go live all at once. You can do it in parts. You know, think of it kind of like cooking. You know, you get all your prep work done up front, and then assemble the meal as the very last step. And then the final phase is execution, where you design and code the front end, you get the back end developed, you implement the data migration, and finally go live with the new website. But you know, really don't kid yourself here, folks. Magento 2 is a whole new platform. You know, by migrating to Magento 2, you're really undertaking the same pain and experience as starting over. This is not a quick fix upgrade. With that said, Ryan, if you would walk us through the danger points we should be aware of.
All right. So a couple of tips about the migration is, first of all, you want to establish baselines. So it's better to establish baselines to get an idea of how long a migration will take in order to see what kind of time frames and resources you need to dedicate to migration, because you do not want to have the cutover and not run this migration ahead of time, because there might be things like document mapping errors or data that you want to have transferred over that you now need to do at the very last minute. You want to establish these baselines ahead of time. How long does it take for this migration to run? How long is it going to take us to do these mappings appropriately? Are we missing just a few columns, or are we missing hundreds of columns through a heavily customized M1 instance? Another thing you want to do is you'll want to prune that database. Don't spend a bunch of extra time importing, exporting your database with a bunch of trash you don't need. Old quotes, quote tables, all that extra stuff that isn't going to be necessary. Old log tables, all this kind of stuff. Import, export log tables. All these different types of tables are not necessary for this migration over. So if you're establishing baselines by re-importing the database and it's a 40 gigabyte or 20 gigabyte database, that's a lot of downtime just to rerun a single mapping. And you want to make sure that you're pruning that database beforehand. And that way it creates a much better process and a much smoother process as you're figuring out the mapping and as you're going through this migration process. Third one is backup. Accidents are going to happen. You know, if you have a starting point, you take a backup of that point from both sides before you start. That is M1 and M2. So you're going to take the initial backup of the M1 instance, but also take a backup of the M2 instance, especially if something happens like the data gets corrupted through something that is thrown invalid or some sort of error that gets thrown through one of your custom classes. Anything like that can corrupt the data, and then you might have to start all the way from scratch. So establish these baselines and back up that data. Okay? You can easily recover from errors that way if you have your backups. And of course, more power is always key. Now, the data migration tool, like I said before, is an ETL tool, which is an extract, transform, and load tool. And this tool is really good and it's really fast, but the more data you have, the longer it's going to take, meaning that the more power that you put into this, the faster it will be. Now, the good news is that you don't have to devote a great deal of money and time and resource to this type of hardware that's more powerful forever. Put the hardware towards this migration and then use whatever hardware that you need for daily operations. So if you maybe want to spin up a temporary instance on a cloud provider, let's say on AWS or even one of Magento's hosting partners, you can spin this up on a temporary level and throw this power at it for the initial migration. Then you'll have your M2 database instance ready to go, and then you can move that over to whatever database you need for regular day-to-day use. So you would export the final database once you're finished and all your mapping's done and your data migration's complete, and then you can just destroy the instances and use the regular hardware that you would use from day-to-day operations. And then after that, you can perform the deltas necessary on the live site, which just isn't going to need as much hardware performance for it because it's only the deltas. You're only bridging the gaps between your migration and the new orders and new information that has been put into your database beforehand. So those are the main tips that you'll want to look at and some of the main points that you want to see. Now, before we adjourn, what we want to do is maybe take a look at the demo and see where we are with it. So going back to our command line, we'll see that the migration step completed. So now we're finished up. And the empty one we saw earlier, we now want to take a look at it and see what's been populated. I was refreshing this in the background. So now we have some of our records that have been imported. And this imported fairly quickly too. A number of different records have been populated, catalog and customers, for example, order, all that information is now available to us from this import. We went from an empty one to a populated one in no time. Okay. All right. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to Amanda.
Great. Thank you, Ryan and Brian. Let's get to some of those questions. Our first one is, will this upgrade process blow up my front end and theme?
Well, I'll take that one. The data migration process will not destroy your M1 instance. It's only going to take data from it, so that's a read-only operation, and then it's going to migrate it over to your Magento 2 instance. So the short answer of that is no, it's not going to destroy your front end.
Cool. All right, our next one is, does this upgrade process change the functionality of my Magento install, and how can I tell or see?
As far as the data goes? As far as the data goes, it's not going to change the functionality of anything, no, because remember, this is just a data migration portion. That would be more of the extension or theme portion of the migration process.
All right. The next one is, we do about 20 million in sales annually, have a complex ERP integration, and utilize about 20 community-built extensions. When should we plan to upgrade to Magento 2?
Well, lots of different issues there. You know, I mean, Magento 2 will feature integration tools like Magento 1. However, given Magento 2 is a new rewrite, you'll need to be creative in those integrations for M2, or, you know, wait for the provider of your you know, your integration like eBridge to create the updated version of your connector for M2.
All right. Okay, the next one, will Magento still sync with my ERP?
Magento 2?
Yeah.
So Magento 2, you'll have to write the extension to do that. Because once again, this is a re-platform that we're going from a Magento 1 instance to a Magento 2 instance. And you will have to write that integration point. Remember, that was the 2 portion of the 3-step migration process. So the first portion is a data portion, but you'll have to write an extension or at least port over an extension by rewriting in order to create that functionality to talk with your ERP system.
Okay. All right, our next question, will it cost us to upgrade to Magento 2?
Let me do that one. So I would say, well, yes, definitely. You know, it's really going to cost you about half as much as migrating Magento to a non-Magento platform. But yes, you're essentially starting over.
Okay. All right, and the next one, is this still in beta?
Magento 2 is still in beta, but its general availability release is this quarter, and Magento, the company, will announce that.
And remember, there's 2 parts to that. There's the software itself that Ryan's referring to, but then there is the onslaught of extensions that vendors are working furiously to try to upgrade. I think by December, is that right?
That they do want to have a certain number of extensions available at December, but other extension developers are actively working on it as well.
Okay.
Any other questions? No, okay.
I think that's it. Okay, so a big thanks to Ryan Street and Brian Dwyer. Really appreciate you being here today. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any other questions, please let us know. We'll be happy to answer those. We will be providing a recording of this webinar, and any questions we didn't get to will be on there. So be on the lookout for that. And on behalf of InteractOne and our presenters, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.